When we talk about how intelligence agencies influence a conflict, the first layer we have to understand is information itself. Because in modern conflicts, power doesn't just come from weapons or troops, it comes from knowledge. The ability to see more, understand faster, and interpret better than your opponent creates a kind of invisible advantage that often determines outcomes long before any physical confrontation escalates. Intelligence gathering is essentially about reducing uncertainty. Every state involved in a conflict is trying to answer the same fundamental questions. What is the other side planning? How capable are they? Where are they vulnerable? And perhaps most importantly, what do they believe about us? Agencies dedicate enormous resources to answering these questions through surveillance, human intelligence, signal interception, and increasingly cyber capabilities. But what's important to recognize is that this process is never neutral. The moment you begin collecting and interpreting information, you are also shaping reality through your own biases, assumptions, and strategic goals. In high-stakes conflicts, intelligence is not just about defense, it's about anticipation. If you can predict your adversary's next move, you don't just respond, you preempt. That changes the entire logic of conflict. It shifts the balance from reactive to proactive, from uncertainty to calculated control. But here's the deeper philosophical point. The more you rely on intelligence, the more you are also dependent on its accuracy. And history has repeatedly shown that intelligence can fail, not because of lack of data, but because of misinterpretation. The human factor, the way analysts read patterns, assign meaning, and draw conclusions, introduces a margin of error that can have enormous consequences. And at the same time, intelligence agencies don't just collect information, they actively shape it. This is where information becomes a tool of influence. In conflicts, controlling the narrative can be just as important as controlling territory. Agencies may leak selected pieces of intelligence to the media or allies, not to reveal the full truth, but to guide perception. A carefully timed release can signal strength, expose weakness, or even manipulate an adversary's decision-making process. This creates what we might call an information battlefield, where truth and perception are constantly being negotiated. Then there's the issue of disinformation. In a world saturated with information, the challenge is no longer just finding the truth, but distinguishing it from everything else. What intelligence agencies are aware of this, and in many cases, they actively exploit it. By introducing false narratives, planting misleading signals, or amplifying confusion, they can distort an opponent's understanding of reality. And when a decision maker operates on false assumptions, the consequences can cascade quickly and unpredictably. But there's a psychological dimension here that we can't ignore. Intelligence doesn't just influence decisions, it influences fear. The awareness that another side might know your intentions, your capabilities, or even your weaknesses creates a constant sense of vulnerability. This affects how leaders behave. It can lead to caution, overreaction, or in some cases, miscalculation driven by pressure. So, intelligence agencies are not just observers of conflict. They are participants in shaping the emotional and psychological environment in which decisions are made. And perhaps the most important point is this: intelligence is never perfect, but it is always influential. Even incomplete or flawed information can drive actions that change the course of a conflict. In that sense, intelligence doesn't have to be fully accurate to be powerful. It just has to be believed. That belief, whether justified or not, becomes a force in itself. So when we think about intelligence agencies and their role in conflict, we shouldn't imagine them as passive collectors of secrets. We should see them as active architects of uncertainty and clarity at the same time, deciding what is known, what is hidden, and what is believed. They operate in the space between reality and perception. And in that space, decisions are made that can escalate or de-escalate tensions, prolong or prevent conflict. And that leads us to a deeper realization. In modern geopolitics, knowledge is not just power, it is influence. And influence, when combined with uncertainty, becomes one of the most decisive forces in the world today. Because ultimately, the side that understands the game of information, how to gather it, how to interpret it, and how to use it, doesn't just react to the world. It shapes it. When we move beyond information and into action, we enter a much more sensitive and often less visible dimension of how intelligence agencies influence conflict, covert operations. This is where intelligence stops being about understanding the world and starts becoming about changing it quietly, deliberately, and often in ways that are never fully acknowledged. Covert operations are, by design, meant to remain hidden. They include activities like sabotage, cyber intrusions, targeted disruptions, and strategic interventions that are carried out without formal attribution. The objective is simple: achieve a strategic outcome without triggering open confrontation. And that's important because in today's interconnected world, direct conflict between major powers carries enormous risks. So instead, influence is applied indirectly through actions that sit in that gray zone between peace and war. What makes covert operations so powerful is not just what they do, but what they represent. They reflect a fundamental truth about modern geopolitics. Influence is often more effective when it is invisible. If a nation can weaken an adversary without openly engaging them, it gains an advantage while avoiding the costs of escalation. But this also creates a paradox. The more these operations are used, the more uncertain the global environment becomes, and uncertainty in itself becomes a strategic tool. From a psychological perspective, covert operations introduce a constant undercurrent of doubt. Leaders may suspect that something is happening behind the scenes, but they cannot always prove it. That uncertainty affects decision-making. It creates hesitation, second-guessing, and sometimes overreaction. When you don't know exactly what your opponent is doing, you start preparing for multiple possibilities at once. That can lead to defensive postures, increased spending, and a general atmosphere of tension, even in the absence of direct confrontation. At the same time, covert operations are not just about disruption, they are about shaping outcomes. Whether it's disrupting infrastructure, interfering with communications, or influencing key systems, the goal is often to create enough instability to tilt the balance in a desired direction. These actions can have ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate target, influencing markets, alliances, and even domestic politics within affected countries. But here's where the philosophical layer becomes important. Covert operations challenge our traditional understanding of accountability. When something happens, who is responsible? If an action is never officially acknowledged, does it still carry the same moral and political weight? These are not easy questions, and they sit at the heart of modern intelligence strategy. Because in this space, actions are often deniable, but their effects are very real. There is also a strategic tension between effectiveness and escalation. Every covert action carries the risk of exposure. And when operations are exposed, they can trigger backlash, retaliation, or loss of trust between nations. So intelligence agencies must constantly balance impact against risk. That balancing act is not purely technical, it is deeply political and psychological. It involves weighing not just what can be done, but what should be done and what the consequences might be if things don't go as planned. And we also need to consider the technological dimension. In the past, covert operations might have relied on physical presence or human assets. Today, much of this activity has moved into the digital space. Cyber operations can disable systems, steal information, or disrupt critical infrastructure, all without crossing physical borders. So this changes the scale and speed of covert influence. Actions can now happen in milliseconds, and their impact can spread globally in ways that are difficult to predict or contain. But perhaps the most important insight here is this. Covert operations are not just about power, they are about control in a world where direct control is increasingly difficult to maintain. As global systems become more interconnected, influence becomes more subtle, more indirect, and in many ways more complex. Intelligence agencies operate within that complexity, trying to guide outcomes without triggering the very consequences they seek to avoid. At the same time, this creates a kind of strategic ambiguity in international relations. Nations are often left to interpret actions without clear attribution, and in that ambiguity, trust erodes. When you cannot be certain who is responsible for what, every move becomes more cautious, every signal more carefully scrutinized. Over time, this can lead to a more fragile global environment, one where stability exists, but only just beneath the surface. And so, when we look at covert operations, we are really looking at a form of influence that operates in the shadows, but casts very long shadows indeed. It reminds us that not all power is visible and not all actions are acknowledged, but all actions have consequences. And in the end, that is the defining challenge of this space, navigating a world where the most important moves are often the ones you are never meant to see. Because in modern conflict, what is hidden can shape what is known, and what is unknown can shape everything. If we move one layer deeper beyond information and beyond covert action, we arrive at something that is often underestimated but profoundly influential: alliances, diplomacy, and proxy influence. Intelligence agencies play a critical role here, not just in shaping conflict directly, but in shaping who stands with whom, who trusts whom, and how power is distributed across networks rather than just borders. At its core, an alliance is built on trust. But in geopolitics, trust is rarely absolute. It's conditional, strategic, and constantly reassessed. Intelligence agencies sit at the center of this dynamic because they provide the information that allows states to evaluate allies and adversaries alike. They assess reliability, intentions, and risks. In doing so, they don't just inform diplomacy, they shape it. Because when a government believes it has accurate intelligence, it is more willing to commit. When it doubts, it hesitates. This creates a subtle but powerful feedback loop. Intelligence strengthens alliances by increasing confidence, but it can also strain them when information is shared selectively or interpreted differently. Even among allies, there is always a degree of competition for influence, for strategic advantage, and sometimes for autonomy. Intelligence sharing becomes a form of currency in that environment. The more you share, the more trust you signal, but the more you rely on others, the more exposed you become, and that tension never fully disappears. Now, beyond formal alliances, we have something even more complex: proxy influence. This is where intelligence agencies extend their reach indirectly, supporting groups, networks, or actors that align with their strategic interests. These proxies can take many forms: political movements, militias, regional partners, or even non-state actors operating in the margins of established systems. The logic behind proxy influence is both practical and strategic. It allows a state to project power without direct engagement, reducing risk while maintaining influence, but it also creates layers of separation. The sponsor is not always visible, and the proxy is not always fully controlled. That distance introduces both flexibility and uncertainty. It gives agencies room to maneuver, but it also means outcomes are not entirely predictable. And this is where the psychological dimension becomes especially important. When conflicts are shaped by proxies, accountability becomes blurred. Each side can claim limited involvement while still benefiting from the outcomes. This ambiguity complicates diplomacy. It makes negotiation harder because the real centers of power are not always at the table. And when the key actors are not directly engaged, resolving the conflict becomes significantly more complex. At the same time, proxy dynamics can intensify conflicts in ways that are not immediately visible, because when multiple external actors are involved indirectly, local disputes can quickly become part of a larger geopolitical contest. What may begin as a regional issue can escalate into a broader struggle, not because of the original actors alone, but because of the interests layered on top of them. Intelligence agencies facilitate this process by identifying opportunities, assessing risks, and guiding decisions about when and how to engage. They help policymakers answer difficult questions. Where should we invest influence? Which actors are reliable? Which risks are acceptable? These are not purely military questions. They are strategic judgments shaped by intelligence analysis, political priorities, and long-term vision. But there is also a philosophical tension here. By engaging through proxies, states are effectively outsourcing elements of conflict. This raises questions about responsibility. If an action is taken through an intermediary, who bears the consequences? The direct actor, the sponsor, or both? And how do we judge the morality of a system where influence is intentionally distributed across multiple layers to obscure accountability? These are not abstract questions. They have real implications for how conflicts evolve and how they are resolved. Because the more complex the network of influence becomes, the harder it is to reach clear agreements. And without clarity, resolution becomes elusive. Another important aspect is how alliances themselves are shaped by intelligence. Information asymmetry, who knows what and who knows it first, can influence which countries align with each other. States often choose their partners based not only on shared interests, but on shared intelligence assessments. If two countries see the world in similar ways, they are more likely to cooperate. If their perceptions diverge even slightly, that can create friction over time. So intelligence doesn't just operate within alliances, it helps construct them. It defines the boundaries of trust, the limits of cooperation, and the depth of engagement. And once those boundaries are set, they are not easily changed. Ultimately, what we see is a shift from a world of rigid alliances to a world of fluid networks where influence is distributed, partnerships are conditional, and loyalty is constantly tested. Intelligence agencies are not just participants in this system. They are architects of it. They determine how information flows between allies, how support is structured through proxies, and how influence is extended across regions. And that brings us to a broader realization. In today's geopolitical landscape, power is not just about who stands on your side. It's about how that support is built, managed, and sustained over time. Because in the end, alliances are not just agreements. They are reflections of trust. And trust, once shaped by intelligence, becomes one of the most decisive forces in global affairs. When we talk about the influence of intelligence agencies, we can't ignore perhaps the most subtle and in some ways the most powerful dimension of all: psychological influence and public perception. Because in modern conflicts, controlling how people think can be just as impactful as controlling physical territory. In fact, in many cases, it determines whether conflicts escalate, stabilize, or even begin in the first place. Let's start with a simple idea. Perception is reality in politics. Leaders don't act based on objective truth alone. They act based on how they perceive threats, opportunities, and risks. And those perceptions are not formed in isolation. They are shaped by information, media, narratives, and sometimes by deliberate influence. Intelligence agencies understand this very well. And as a result, they don't just observe perception, they actively engage with it. One of the primary tools in this space is the controlled release of information. Intelligence agencies may choose to declassify or leak certain pieces of intelligence at strategic moments. This isn't done randomly. It's done with intention. A well-timed release can send a signal to allies, to adversaries, and to the public. It can demonstrate capability, expose vulnerabilities, or shape the narrative around a conflict in a way that aligns with broader strategic goals. But here's the deeper layer. Information doesn't just inform, it influences emotion. Fear, confidence, uncertainty, outrage, these are not just reactions. They are tools in the psychological landscape of conflict. When people feel threatened, they are more likely to support decisive action. When they feel secure, they may resist escalation. Intelligence agencies, directly or indirectly, understand how to influence these emotional responses by shaping the flow of information. And in a world where media ecosystems are fragmented and constantly evolving, the speed at which information travels has transformed the nature of influence. Narratives can spread globally in seconds. And once a narrative takes hold, it can be extremely difficult to counter. This creates an environment where perception can sometimes outpace reality. By the time accurate information is available, the initial narrative may have already shaped opinions and decisions. So now we also have to consider the role of disinformation, not just misinformation, but the deliberate effort to distort or manipulate perception. In a complex information environment, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Intelligence agencies may engage in or counter these efforts depending on their objectives. The result is a kind of informational competition where different actors are not just competing for power, but for credibility. This competition has profound implications for trust. Trust is the foundation of stable societies, but it is also one of the most fragile elements. Once trust is eroded, whether between governments, between institutions, or between people, it is extremely difficult to rebuild. And intelligence-driven influence, when perceived as manipulation, can contribute to that erosion. So, while these actions may achieve short-term objectives, they can also create long-term challenges. There is also a domestic dimension to consider. Intelligence agencies don't just operate on the global stage. They also influence internal stability. So, in theory, by shaping how threats are perceived, they can affect public opinion, policy debates, and even electoral outcomes. This raises important questions about the balance between security and transparency. How much should the public know? And who decides what is necessary to disclose? These are not just policy questions, they are philosophical ones, because they go to the heart of how societies understand truth, authority, and legitimacy. In democratic systems especially, public perception plays a critical role in shaping government action. If the public perceives a threat, leaders are under pressure to respond. If the public questions that perception, leaders may hesitate. Intelligence agencies, by shaping what is known, indirectly shape that dynamic. But perhaps the most important point here is this. In modern conflict, perception itself has become a domain of competition. It is no longer enough to win on the battlefield or in negotiations. You must also influence how the conflict is understood, both by your own population and by the global audience. Because in a connected world, legitimacy matters, and legitimacy is built not just on action, but on narrative. And this brings us to a critical insight. The line between information, influence, and persuasion is becoming increasingly blurred. What begins as analysis can become messaging. What begins as reporting can become signaling. And what begins as observation can become intervention. Intelligence agencies operate at the intersection of all three. So when we think about psychological influence, we are really talking about the ability to shape not just what people know, but how they interpret what they know. That interpretation then drives behavior. And behavior at scale becomes a force that can influence the trajectory of entire conflicts. In that sense, intelligence agencies are not just participants in conflict. They are participants in shaping the collective mindset through which conflict is understood. And in a world where narratives move faster than facts, that role becomes more significant every day. Because ultimately, power in the modern era is not just about force or information. It is about influence over perception. And whoever understands how to shape that perception doesn't just respond to the world. They define it,